The first time I suspected something was wrong was 6 years ago. Elise, my wife of 8 years, had started coming home later than usual. At first, it was easy to explain away: work meetings, errands, gym sessions. But little inconsistencies began to pile up. One evening, I found a receipt for dinner at a restaurant I'd never been to. When I asked, she brushed it off, claiming it was a business meeting she forgot to mention. That night, she snapped at me for digging into her private life. Private life? We were married. How could she have a life I wasn't a part of? Elise had always been outspoken and headstrong, traits that had initially drawn me to her. But now, they came across as cold and dismissive. Her phone was glued to her hand, her smiles were absent, and her once vivid laughter had turned hollow. I wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions. People have rough patches. Work can be stressful. But my gut told me there was something more. I decided to wait and watch. My name's Nathan. I'm not a pushover or the kind of guy who lets people walk all over him, and that included Elise. But 6 years ago, when I first sensed her lies, I didn't confront her head-on. I wanted to be sure, to have proof, because I knew she'd twist the narrative. Elise had a talent for making people feel small, while she walked away looking spotless. So, I began keeping track. Small notes here, a photo there. I followed patterns, pieced together timelines. Over the years, I uncovered fragments of a hidden life, unexplained trips, unfamiliar names in her contacts, and whispers that fell silent when I entered a room. At first, it was painful. The idea of my wife betraying me was like a gut punch. But as the years passed, that pain turned into something colder. Elise didn't know it, but she was weaving the rope I'd eventually use to hang her metaphorically. I didn't just want a divorce. I wanted her to feel the weight of her actions. I wanted her world to collapse the way she'd started tearing down mine. That's how it started. 6 years of patience, of waiting, of playing dumb while she lied through her teeth. But everything changed the night I caught her red-handed. And then came the news that flipped the entire script. A revelation so shocking it could have ended the game entirely. It wasn't just the late nights or the guarded phone. Those were the obvious things. What tipped me off were the little details. The way her perfume lingered longer than it should after a work meeting. Or how she started keeping her phone on silent, face down on the table. I started piecing together her movements. Elise would leave the house saying she had a client dinner, but her location would tell a different story. It was subtle at first, little lies that wouldn't hold up under scrutiny, like how she claimed she was meeting Sarah, her best friend. But Sarah had tagged herself on a vacation in Mexico. I could have confronted her then, but I knew Elise. She was a master manipulator. If I brought it up without hard evidence, she'd find a way to flip the narrative, make me out to be paranoid or controlling. No, I had to play this smart. So, I started tracking her. I didn't hire a private investigator. That felt too distant. I wanted to be the one who unraveled her web of lies. I began small, checking her emails when she forgot to log out, noting down odd names and messages. One name stood out: Aaron. She mentioned him casually at first, a coworker who's been helping me with the new project. But Aaron started showing up more and more. Text notifications, excuses to stay late at the office, even a lingering smile when she thought I wasn't watching. The hardest part wasn't the betrayal. It was pretending everything was fine. Sitting across from her at dinner, listening to her drone on about her busy day, when I knew exactly what, or who, was keeping her busy. One evening, I followed her after she said she had a work event. She didn't go to the office or the conference center she mentioned. Instead, she pulled into the parking lot of a hotel on the edge of town. She stayed there for 3 hours. I sat in my car the entire time, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. When she finally left, she looked flustered, her hair slightly out of place. I didn't need to see Aaron to know he was there. That was the first time I thought about revenge. Not just exposing her lies, but making her feel the humiliation she'd so easily inflicted on me. But revenge required precision, timing. For now, I'd let her think she was getting away with it. As much as it killed me to wait, I knew it would be worth it in the end. Elise's world would come crashing down, but only when I was ready. I kept playing the role of the clueless husband, but every day I was collecting more evidence. I created a digital journal where I tracked her movements, noted every lie she told, and stored screenshots of her texts that I managed to pull off her synced laptop. Elise had no idea she was leaving a breadcrumb trail, and I was happy to follow it. The hotel visits became more frequent. She'd come home late, throwing off half-hearted excuses like, the team wanted to grab drinks, or, I had to stay back for a late call with the London office. The lies started to lose their finesse as if she didn't care whether or not I believed her. But that's the thing about Elise. She was arrogant. She always believed she was the smartest person in the room. And why wouldn't she? She'd gotten away with lying and manipulating people her entire life. Her sharp tongue and quick wit could cut through any confrontation. But this time, she underestimated me. One night, I decided to push her buttons, just to see how far she'd go to cover her tracks. "Hey," I said casually as she walked in the door at nearly midnight. "Sarah called earlier. She mentioned she hadn't seen you in weeks." Her face froze for a split second, a flicker of panic so brief most people would have missed it, but I caught it. Then, just as quickly, she laughed it off. "Oh, Sarah's always so dramatic. I saw her last week. You know how she is." "Right," I replied, pretending to buy her excuse. But internally, I knew I'd caught her in another lie. The following day, I installed a GPS tracker on her car. It was simple, discreet, and gave me a front-row seat to her secret life. She thought she was so clever, parking in secluded lots, changing her routine, even staying overnight at a friend's from time to time. But the tracker didn't lie, and neither did the cameras I placed in our home. The cameras were my ace in the hole. I had placed one in the living room, one in the kitchen, and a small one in the bedroom. Elise's vanity knew no bounds, and she often FaceTimed Aaron from our own bed, assuming I was oblivious. I recorded everything, every flirtatious giggle, every lingering glance. The more I watched, the colder I became. The love I once felt for her was slowly replaced by something darker, a need for justice, for retribution. And then it happened. Late one night, as she slept beside me, her phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen and saw Aaron's name. Without thinking, I unlocked her phone. She hadn't even bothered to change her passcode, and scrolled through their messages. They weren't just planning rendezvous anymore. They were talking about the future, selling the house, splitting finances. "Once I have enough saved up, we can finally leave this all behind," she wrote. Leave? She was planning to walk out on me after years of deception, and she had the audacity to talk about it like I was just some obstacle to overcome. That's when I decided enough was enough. Elise thought she was in control, but she had no idea the storm I was about to unleash. A week after I read those texts, Elise started acting even more reckless. It was as though she'd made peace with the idea of leaving me. She stopped bothering with excuses and instead went full-on confrontational. "Why are you always questioning me, Nathan?" she snapped one evening when I casually asked if she'd be home for dinner. "Do you think I'm just sitting around waiting for you all day? I have a life, you know?" I let her words hang in the air, letting her feel as though she'd won the argument. I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of seeing me hurt or defensive. Elise thrived on control, and I was no longer willing to give her any. What she didn't know was that I'd been preparing behind the scenes. Quietly, methodically, I'd made copies of everything. Bank statements, emails, even the deed to the house that was in my name. Elise might have been planning her escape, but I wasn't about to make it easy for her. Every financial transaction she made, every sneaky transfer to her hidden savings account, I tracked it all. But the real kicker came when I decided to meet Aaron. I found him easily enough. He wasn't exactly hiding. Guys like Aaron never do. He was the stereotypical charmer, all swagger and cheap cologne. I followed him to a bar one night, where he was predictably hitting on someone who wasn't my wife. Watching him, I felt a cold satisfaction. Elise had thrown away our life for this. When he left, I followed him to his car. "Aaron?" I called out casually, as though I were an old friend. He turned, confused. "Yeah? Do I know you?" "You know my wife," I said, my voice calm but cutting. I watched the realization hit him like a freight train. He stammered for a moment before laughing nervously. "Look, man, I don't know what you've heard, but save it." I took a step closer, my calm exterior masking the rage bubbling beneath. "I'm not here to fight. Frankly, you're not worth the effort." But I thought you should know, Elise isn't half as smart as she thinks she is. And you? You're just her next stepping stone. She'll drop you the second you stop being useful. Aaron tried to play it cool, but I saw the doubt flicker across his face. I could tell he hadn't thought that far ahead. He wasn't Elise's endgame. He was just another pawn in her game. Whatever, man, he muttered, brushing past me, but I knew my words had landed. That night, I started laying the groundwork for the next phase of my plan. I wasn't just going to destroy Elise's world. I was going to make her regret every single decision that brought her to this point. Aaron might have shrugged me off that night, but I knew I'd planted a seed. And seeds grow when they're fed the right kind of poison. Elise was too preoccupied with her own schemes to notice how I was slowly dismantling her carefully curated life. The first move was subtle. I started redirecting her access to certain accounts. Elise thought she was building a financial safety net to run off with Aaron, but I made sure the money trail dried up without her realizing it. Transfers mysteriously failed, credit card limits were reduced, and her so-called hidden savings were suddenly inaccessible. She blamed the bank at first, yelling into her phone about incompetent systems. I listened from the other room, biting back a smile as she called Aaron to complain. "We'll figure it out," he assured her. "Just give me some time." But time wasn't on their side. The second move was more deliberate. I began documenting Elise's infidelity in a way no court could ignore. Screenshots, video footage, even audio recordings of her late-night conversations with Aaron. Everything was compiled into a neat little dossier, complete with timestamps. But the crown jewel of my evidence came when I intercepted an email Elise sent to her divorce lawyer. It outlined her plans to claim half of everything I owned, including the house, under the guise of emotional abuse. She painted me as controlling, paranoid, and even hinted that I'd been unfaithful first. That email was all I needed to confirm what I already knew. Elise wasn't just cheating. She was setting me up to be the villain. It didn't even hurt anymore. If anything, it fueled me. I decided it was time to make my presence known. That night, while Elise was in the shower, I slipped her phone out of her purse and sent Aaron a message. "Nathan knows. We need to be more careful." I waited. Her phone buzzed with his reply minutes later. "What does he know? Did you tell him anything?" I smiled, slipped the phone back, and waited for her to pick up the conversation. Sure enough, as soon as she stepped out of the bathroom, towel wrapped around her, she checked her phone and froze. "What's wrong?" I asked, feigning concern. "Nothing," she muttered, but her face said otherwise. The cracks were forming. Elise was starting to feel the walls close in, though she didn't yet realize I was the one holding the hammer. That night, she was restless. I could feel her tossing and turning in bed, her mind racing to figure out if I knew anything. Or worse, how much. It was exactly where I wanted her. By now, Elise was unraveling, and it was a beautiful thing to watch. She started checking her phone obsessively, sneaking off to take calls and whispering into the receiver like a teenager caught in a lie. She didn't know what I knew, or how much I had orchestrated, but the paranoia was eating at her. One day, she snapped at me for no reason. "Why do you always have to hover around? Can't you find something to do other than breathing down my neck?" I just smiled at her. "Sure, Elise. Whatever you need." The thing about Elise was that she thrived on control, on being the puppet master of everyone in her life. But now that she felt the strings slipping through her fingers, she didn't know how to cope. The next step of my plan was simple: isolate her. Aaron, her escape route, was still under the impression that Elise had everything under control. He didn't realize she was floundering, or that I was systematically cutting off every lifeline she had. Using a burner phone, I sent Aaron a series of anonymous texts. "Elise isn't who you think she is. She's playing you, just like she's playing her husband." The first few messages were ignored, but I kept at it. I sent screenshots of texts she'd sent me in the past, ones where she talked about how boring and predictable Aaron was. I included a few choice photos from her hidden stash, ones I knew she hadn't sent to Aaron. When he finally responded, it was a mix of confusion and anger. "Who is this? What do you want?" I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The seed of doubt had been planted, and I knew Aaron's insecurities would do the rest. Meanwhile, at home, Elise's behavior became more erratic. She was spending hours locked in the bedroom, pacing back and forth and snapping at me for the smallest things. One night, I decided to press her. "Everything okay?" I asked, leaning against the kitchen counter as she frantically scrolled through her phone. "Of course," she snapped, not even looking up. "You seem tense," I continued, my voice calm but laced with an edge. "Work? Or is it Aaron?" The look on her face was priceless. Her eyes widened, her lips parted slightly, and for a split second, she looked genuinely afraid. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, her voice a little too sharp. "I don't know what you're talking about." I just smiled, letting the silence stretch between us. She didn't know it yet, but her world was crumbling, and I was about to take the final step to make sure there was no way out. Elise's confidence had crumbled into a brittle facade, and it was time to shatter it completely. Over the past 6 years, I'd gathered everything I needed to ensure her downfall. The texts, the hotel receipts, the lawyer's email, and now, Aaron's increasing paranoia, thanks to my subtle manipulation. I started planting small hints that I knew more than I let on. I'd accidentally leave my laptop open on documents titled Divorce Proceedings or Infidelity Evidence. I'd glance at her just long enough to make her wonder if I was onto her, but never long enough to confirm it. One evening, I made my move. "Elise, we need to talk," I said over dinner. My tone was calm, measured, almost casual. She froze mid-bite, her fork hovering in the air. "About what?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "Us." "What about us?" she asked, her voice defensive, but her eyes betrayed her. She was already calculating, already preparing her next lie. "I've been thinking," I said, pausing to sip my drink. "We've grown distant. I want to understand why. I want to know if there's something I've done." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Nathan, if this is about me being busy—" "It's not," I interrupted, my voice suddenly sharp enough to cut through her deflections. "It's about trust." The word hung in the air like smoke, suffocating the room. "I don't understand," she said after a long pause. "Don't you?" I replied, locking eyes with her. "Don't you think I deserve to know the truth, Elise? After everything we've been through?" For a moment, I thought she might confess. Her mouth opened, then closed again as if she were weighing her options. But in true Elise fashion, she doubled down. "You're being paranoid," she said, her tone condescending. "I don't know what's gotten into you, but maybe you should stop overthinking everything." I nodded slowly, leaning back in my chair. "You're right. Maybe I've been imagining things." The relief on her face was almost laughable, but I wasn't done. Not even close. The next morning, I sent an email to her office's HR department, attaching a carefully edited video of Elise's hotel rendezvous with Aaron, complete with timestamps that overlapped with her business trips. I didn't stop there. I mailed copies of her lawyer's email and screenshots of her texts to Aaron's wife. Yes, Aaron had a wife. One he conveniently forgot to mention to Elise. The hypocrisy was almost poetic. By the end of the day, I'd set a storm in motion that neither Elise nor Aaron could control. Elise came home that evening, her face pale and her hands trembling. She didn't say a word to me as she walked past, heading straight to the bedroom and slamming the door shut. I knew the dominoes were falling. And the best part? This was only the beginning. The next morning, Elise was a shadow of herself. Her usual sharp tongue and aloof demeanor had been replaced by a skittishness I'd never seen before. She avoided my gaze during breakfast, her fingers nervously drumming on the edge of her coffee mug. "What's wrong?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "Nothing," she mumbled, but I could see it. The panic was bubbling just beneath the surface. By noon, the first blow landed. Elise's company had begun an internal investigation into her conduct, thanks to the email I'd sent to HR. Apparently, they took relationships between employees very seriously, especially ones that involved misusing company resources to cover up personal escapades. Her phone buzzed constantly throughout the day, each call and text escalating her anxiety. I didn't ask who it was. I didn't need to. I already knew it was Aaron, spiraling as his carefully balanced double life started to collapse. By the evening, Elise couldn't hold it in anymore. "Nathan, I need to tell you something," she said hesitantly, her voice cracking slightly. I looked up from my book, keeping my expression neutral. What is it? She faltered, running her hands through her hair. I think someone's been spreading lies about me at work. Someone's trying to sabotage me. Lies? I echoed, raising an eyebrow. What kind of lies? I don't know, she snapped, frustration flaring. Something about inappropriate relationships. It's ridiculous. I'd never do something like that. The audacity of her denial almost made me laugh, but I kept my composure. That's serious, I said, nodding thoughtfully. Do you think someone's targeting you? I don't know, she repeated, her voice trembling now. Maybe it's someone jealous of my success. People can be petty like that. I stared at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until she squirmed under my gaze. Well, I said finally, I'm sure the truth will come out. Her eyes widened slightly at my words, but she said nothing. That night, I received a message on the burner phone I'd used to contact Aaron. You're a sick bastard. Elise told me everything. You've ruined her career, and for what? Because you couldn't handle the truth? I smiled, typing my response carefully. The truth? The truth is, you're just as pathetic as she is. How does it feel to realize you were never her first choice? Or even her last? He didn't reply. Meanwhile, Aaron's wife was busy setting her own plans in motion. From what I'd gleaned from her social media posts, she had already kicked him out and filed for divorce. Elise's perfect escape was crumbling, and I hadn't even delivered the killing blow yet. Elise's life was unraveling faster than even I anticipated. The investigation at her office had escalated, and she was put on administrative leave while they gathered more information. The smug confidence she once carried had completely vanished. Her sharp glares and biting remarks had been replaced by nervous pacing and whispered phone calls in the corner of the house. She didn't say much to me those days, and I didn't press her. Letting her stew in her paranoia was part of the plan. But Aaron wasn't taking it so well. He showed up at the house one evening, pounding on the door like a madman. Elise ran to the window when she heard the noise, her face draining of color when she saw him. Don't answer it, she hissed at me. I stood there for a moment, staring at her. Why not? Isn't that your coworker? I let the word hang in the air, dripping with implication. Nathan, please, she whispered, her voice cracking. Just don't. I shrugged and walked away, leaving her to deal with the fallout. She didn't open the door, and after about 20 minutes, Aaron finally left, shouting something unintelligible before peeling out of the driveway. When she came back into the living room, I could see the cracks forming. Her hands were shaking, her eyes red from what I guessed were either tears or frustration. Everything okay? I asked, my tone calm, as if I weren't the architect of her chaos. It's fine, she snapped, but there was no conviction in her voice. Later that night, when Elise finally went to bed, I checked the camera footage I'd planted in the house. Watching her argue with Aaron over the phone while pacing around the kitchen was almost too satisfying. You told me you had this under control, he shouted on the other end, his voice muffled but clear enough to make out. I did, she hissed back, gripping the edge of the counter. How was I supposed to know my husband would start snooping around? He was never like this before. Well, he knows something now, doesn't he? Aaron fired back. He's wrecked everything. My wife kicked me out. My job's on the line. Elise didn't reply, just buried her face in her hands. The next day, I decided to strike another blow. I sent the full dossier, texts, videos, and all, to her parents. Elise had always maintained an air of perfection around them, acting like the dutiful daughter with the perfect marriage. I knew their old-school values wouldn't take kindly to the truth. That evening, her mother called while I was sitting on the couch, pretending to read. Elise answered in the other room, but her voice quickly rose as the conversation spiraled out of control. How dare you accuse me of something like that? She shouted, but the panic in her voice betrayed her. I don't know where you're getting this from. I smiled to myself, imagining her mother reading through the evidence while Elise scrambled to come up with a believable lie. When she finally came back into the living room, she looked like she'd aged 10 years in a single day. She sat down across from me, silent for a long moment before finally speaking. Nathan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Is there something you want to tell me? I looked up from my book, feigning confusion. What do you mean? She stared at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. Have you been talking to anyone? Sharing things about me? I set the book down and met her gaze. Why would I do that, Elise? You've always said we should keep our personal lives private, haven't you? She didn't reply. She just stood up and left the room, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The walls were closing in, and Elise knew it. But she had no idea the worst was yet to come.